Morning warmth. The morning began like every other day in that small, quiet house. The sun rose slowly, and its soft golden light slipped through the thin curtains in the living room. The rays touched the old furniture, the polished wooden floor, and the framed photographs that lined the walls. Everything looked calm, almost frozen in a gentle moment. The house was never truly noisy, but when the parents left for work, it became even more still. The last sound of the car pulling out of the driveway faded away, and silence wrapped itself around the rooms. Only the faint ticking of the wall clock reminded anyone inside that time was still moving. For her, mornings were always filled with a strange comfort. She liked how the world felt unhurried in those first hours. She sat by the window with a half-empty cup of tea, watching tiny dust motes floating in the sunlight. They danced slowly like little stars caught in the air. Somewhere outside, a bird sang, its tune soft and sweet, almost like a secret meant only for her. In the kitchen, the smell of warm toast still lingered, mixed with the faint scent of coffee. The cups they had used clinked quietly in the sink, left behind in a neat row. Every sound, no matter how small, felt sharper in the silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old ceiling fan, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, and then there was the sound of footsteps. Slow, steady, almost careful. Grandpa walked into the room with his usual calm presence. His hair was silver, his back a little bent, but his eyes carried a warmth that made the room feel less empty. He wore his simple sweater, the same one he often did on mornings like this, soft from years of use. He looked at her and smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that demanded attention. It was gentle, almost shy, as if it carried its own quiet story. "Already awake?" he asked, his voice low but filled with affection. She nodded, setting her cup down on the table. "Couldn't sleep more. The house feels so quiet after they leave." He chuckled softly, a sound that felt like the soft crackle of firewood. "Quiet is good. You hear yourself better when the world isn't so loud." He moved to the kitchen and poured himself coffee. The sound of liquid filling the cup was small, but in that silence it felt like music. He stirred slowly with a spoon, the soft clink of metal against porcelain echoing in the air. Then he carried the cup back and sat across from her. The chair gave a little creak under his weight, and for a while they said nothing. But it was not an empty silence. It was the kind that carried comfort, the kind that made words unnecessary. The clock ticked steadily, filling the pauses between their breaths. She looked at him, studying the lines on his face. They were marks of time, of years lived, of stories untold. Yet those same lines made him look kind, made him look strong in a quiet way. There was something safe in his presence, something that made the house feel alive again. "Did you eat enough?" he asked suddenly, his tone more like a soft command than a question. She laughed lightly. "Yes, Grandpa. I'm not a child anymore." His eyes softened, but his lips curved into a teasing smile. "To me, you'll always be one. Even when you think you're grown, I still see that little one running through the garden." She smiled back, warmth rising in her chest. The words felt like a blanket, something old but still comforting. The way he said them carried more than just memory. It carried care, protection, and something else she could not name. For a while, they spoke about small things. The weather, the neighbor's new car, the way the roses in the garden had started to bloom earlier this year. But beneath their words there was a rhythm, a quiet music that only they seemed to hear. His voice was calm, slow, but every word lingered like it wanted to stay longer in the air. Sometimes she caught herself listening more to how he said things than what he said. And sometimes when their eyes met across the table, the silence grew heavy again, not uncomfortable but charged with something deeper, something that made her heart beat just a little faster. The morning stretched on in its gentle way. Light filled the room more fully now, painting the walls in gold. The clock ticked, the coffee cooled, and yet neither of them moved. They sat together, held by the warmth of the moment, as if the outside world had paused just for them. And though nothing extraordinary had happened yet, the air already carried a secret promise. Something unspoken, something waiting. Familiar company. The morning was moving slowly, the way Sundays often feel, even though it was not Sunday. The quietness of the house seemed to grow softer with every passing minute. The walls seemed to hold their breath, listening to the small sounds of life inside. She sat still at the table, tracing her finger along the rim of her empty cup. The warmth of the tea had faded long ago, but the comfort of the moment had not. She liked mornings like this, when the rest of the world was busy outside and inside it felt like the house belonged only to them. Grandpa returned from the kitchen carrying a fresh cup of coffee. He held it carefully in his hands as if it were something fragile. The steam curled upward in little white threads, rising and fading quickly into the air. He placed the cup on the table with care, the porcelain tapping softly against the wood. "Too quiet, isn't it?" he said, lowering himself into the chair across from her. His voice had that low, soothing tone again, like a whisper of calm. She smiled faintly. "Yes, but I like it. It feels safe." He looked at her for a moment as though her words carried more weight than she realized. His eyes were steady, deep with thought, and yet gentle. "Safe is good. The world out there is not always so kind." She tilted her head, watching him. There was always something about the way he spoke, like he wasn't just answering but giving pieces of himself away with every sentence. She wondered if he noticed how she listened so carefully, holding on to his words longer than necessary. The clock ticked between them, steady and loyal. Outside, a dog barked again, then fell silent. The small noises only made the space between them feel more private, more theirs. "You look tired," he said suddenly, his eyes narrowing in soft concern. "Did you not sleep well last night?" She shrugged, her shoulders rising slowly. "Not really. My mind was busy. I kept thinking, about what?" She hesitated. She wanted to answer, but her thoughts felt too tangled, too complicated to put into simple words. Instead, she gave him a small smile. "Just things." He studied her carefully, but he didn't press. That was the thing about him, he never forced her to speak. He let her choose her silence, and somehow that silence became its own kind of conversation. He sipped his coffee, the soft sound filling the air. The smell of it spread across the table, rich and familiar. She leaned forward slightly, her elbow on the wood, her chin resting on her hand. She watched him, perhaps longer than she should have. The way his hands moved, steady and certain. The way his lips curved around the rim of the cup. The way his eyes always seemed to search hers, as if he wanted to see something hidden inside. "You're staring," he said lightly with a small smile. Her cheeks warmed, and she quickly looked away. "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are," he teased, his voice carrying a rare playfulness. It was soft, but enough to make her heart stir. She laughed, though quietly. "Maybe I am, but only because you look so serious." He leaned back slightly, his smile fading into something gentler. "Seriousness comes with age. You'll understand one day." Her eyes returned to his. "I think I already do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence grew thick again, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where thoughts and feelings pressed against the edges of words but chose not to escape. She could hear her own breathing, steady but deeper now. She wondered if he noticed. To break the weight, he reached out and tapped the table with his finger. "Do you remember when you were little and you used to sit here and ask me for stories? Every morning a new story. You never let me rest." Her lips parted in surprise, then curved into a smile. "Of course I remember. You always told me the best ones. I believed every word. And now?" he asked. She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Now I still believe you, even when you're not telling stories." His gaze softened and a faint sigh escaped him, though it sounded almost like a laugh. He reached for his cup again, but his hand slowed, as if distracted by something unseen. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air thicker, the morning brighter. She felt a warmth in her chest, not just from the sun filtering through the curtains, but from something deeper, something that came only when he looked at her that way. The clock ticked louder, as if reminding them that time had not stopped even though it felt like it had. The world outside was still rushing, cars still passing, people still moving. But here, at this table, everything was slower, quieter, more tender. She shifted in her seat, her hand brushing against the wooden table close to his. Not touching, but close enough to feel the weight of the space between them. Close enough to wonder, he noticed. His eyes flicked down for the briefest moment, then returned to hers. 1,000 unsaid things filled the silence, heavy and alive, and just like that, the morning felt different. Still warm, still safe, but no longer simple. Playful exchanges. The morning stretched into a softer light, filling the room with golden warmth. The clock kept its slow rhythm, and the faint hum of life outside drifted in through the half-open window. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded loosely in her lap, watching him sip his coffee as if there was nothing in the world more important than that moment. The quiet had been deep, but now it was ready to break. She tilted her head and smiled at him, her eyes holding a spark of play. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you always look so serious, like you're thinking about 100 things at once." He set his cup down and raised an eyebrow. "And how do you know that?" "Because I can see it in your face," she replied, leaning forward on her elbows. "You get this little wrinkle here." She pointed toward her own forehead, mimicking him. "Like you're carrying the whole world." He chuckled, the sound light and warm. "Ah, so you're studying me now?" She grinned, her tone teasing. "Maybe I am. Someone has to make sure you're not hiding secrets." He laughed again, shaking his head. "If I had secrets, they'd be too old and boring for you to care about." "Not true," she said quickly, almost leaning across the table. "I'd care. I'd listen, always." The words came out too earnest, too sudden. For a moment, they both felt the weight of what she had said. The air grew heavier, though her smile softened it, and he broke the silence with another laugh, though quieter this time. "You still talk like that little girl who used to chase butterflies in the yard," he said, his voice gentle. She laughed with him, but her cheeks warmed. "And you still talk like you know everything." "I know enough," he replied, sipping his coffee again. His eyes twinkled just a little, that rare playfulness showing itself again. "Enough to see when someone is staring at me for too long." She gasped and covered her mouth with her hand, laughing. "You're still thinking about that?" "I wasn't staring, I was observing." "Observing," he repeated slowly, pretending to consider the word. "That's just another way of saying staring." She leaned back, her laughter still bubbling in her chest. "Fine, maybe I was staring, but only because you're interesting." He raised an eyebrow again, though his smile betrayed his amusement. "Interesting? That's not a word people usually use for me anymore." "Well, they should," she said softly, her voice losing some of its play. "They really should." Their eyes met again, and the playfulness lingered there, but it had grown into something else, something thicker and harder to name. The room felt smaller again, and the silence stretched like it had in the hours before, but this time it pulsed with warmth. To lighten the moment, she reached across the table and tapped the rim of his cup. "Anyway, I don't believe you drink so much coffee. I think you only use it as an excuse to sit here with me." He smiled, his laugh a little lower now. "Maybe I do. Maybe you caught me." Her own laugh joined his, and together they filled the room with something brighter than the morning sun. The birds outside sang again, as if echoing their mood, and even the ticking clock felt less heavy. "You're funnier than people think," she said, her smile refusing to fade. "Don't tell anyone," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I like being taken seriously. It gives me power." She giggled and shook her head. "Power? You're not fooling me. I know you too well." His gaze lingered on her, softer now. "Yes, you do." The words settled between them like a quiet truth, one that neither of them wanted to disturb. The moment stretched, and she found herself fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, unsure where to place her hands. The laughter had faded, but its echo remained like warmth still glowing in the air. She didn't want it to end, didn't want the playfulness to slip into silence again. So she leaned forward, her eyes bright with mischief. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He blinked, surprised, but his smile returned. "You don't ask small questions, do you?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Never." He laughed softly, the sound almost like a sigh. "Well, maybe later. Some things are better saved." She pouted playfully, her lips curving downward. "That's not fair. You can't tease me like that." He chuckled again, clearly amused by her expression. "Life isn't fair. But maybe one day I'll tell you." Her pout turned back into a smile, and she shook her head again, her hair brushing her cheek. "You're impossible." "And yet," he said quietly, "you're still here talking to me." The words carried more weight than either of them expected. They lingered in the air, heavy but tender. She swallowed softly, her heart beating louder in her chest, though she tried to cover it with a smile. "I guess I like impossible things," she whispered. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on her, searching, almost questioning. But then he smiled again, soft and slow, and lifted his cup once more. The sound of his sip filled the silence, and the moment passed like a cloud drifting across the sun. Yet the warmth stayed deeper than before, woven into the laughter, the teasing, and the things left unsaid. And for the first time, the playful exchanges between them felt like more than just play. They felt like the beginning of something neither of them could name, but both of them felt. Charged stillness. The laughter faded, but it left something behind. The room was no longer filled with sound, only with a silence that carried weight. It was not empty silence, it was alive, almost breathing. The kind of silence that made the air feel thicker, the kind that pulled two people closer without a single step. She sat with her hands folded on the table, her eyes fixed on him. He didn't look away this time. His gaze held hers steady, deep, searching, as if trying to read the words she had not spoken. For a moment, neither of them moved. The clock ticked slowly on the wall. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each sound felt louder now, echoing in the quiet. Outside, the bird that had been singing earlier had gone silent, and the world seemed to wait with them. Her breath caught for just a second, a soft hitch that she hoped he hadn't noticed. But his eyes shifted slightly as if he had. The air between them was charged, heavy with unspoken things. She felt her pulse quicken, felt the warmth rise to her cheeks, though nothing had been said. He leaned back slightly in his chair, but his eyes never left her. The movement was slow, almost careful, like he was giving her space without breaking the moment. "You're quiet," he said softly, his voice low, steady. "So are you," she whispered almost too quickly. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze stayed locked on hers, and in that look she felt something deeper than words could ever carry. She wanted to look away, to escape the heaviness of it, but she couldn't. Something inside her wouldn't let go. The warmth of the sun had shifted now, casting longer streaks of light across the table. It painted both of them in gold, highlighting every line, every shadow. She noticed the way the light caught in his silver hair, the way it softened the lines on his face. He looked both strong and fragile at the same time, and it made her chest tighten. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely louder than the ticking clock. He didn't answer right away. His hand moved slowly, brushing the side of his coffee cup, though he didn't lift it. Finally, he said, "Maybe because you're looking at me the same way." Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to pretend it was only a joke. But the truth was clear in her eyes, and he had seen it. She looked down quickly, her fingers tightening on the edge of the tablecloth. The silence returned, thicker now, heavier. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, loud and steady like a faint drum hidden beneath the quiet. She wondered if he could hear it too. He leaned forward just slightly, his arms resting on the table. His voice lowered, softer than before, almost a whisper. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." She looked up again, her eyes wide, searching his face. The weight of his words settled in her chest, deep and unshakable. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The moment stretched. Seconds felt longer, heavier. The house seemed to hold its breath. Every sound muted except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the clock. Her hand moved slowly, almost without her knowing. Her fingers brushed against the table, closer to his. Not touching, but close enough that the distance felt fragile, like a thread waiting to snap. He noticed. His eyes flicked down, then back to hers. He didn't move his hand away, didn't close the space either. He simply watched, his gaze steady, his breath calm but deeper now. "You shouldn't," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "Maybe," he answered softly, "but sometimes the heart doesn't listen." Her chest tightened at his words, her breath catching again. She looked away, staring at the sunlight on the wall, at the patterns it made as the curtains swayed gently in the breeze. But no matter where she looked, she felt his eyes on her. The air grew warmer, thicker, like the room itself had changed. She shifted slightly in her seat, her hands restless, her thoughts tangled. She wanted to speak, to laugh, to break the weight of it, but she also wanted to stay in it, to feel it longer, deeper. When she finally looked at him again, his expression was unreadable. Gentle, yes, but layered with something more. Something he didn't say, something she couldn't name. The silence between them was charged, almost electric, and yet it felt safe at the same time. Her lips parted again, and this time words came, though they were quiet. "It feels strange." He tilted his head slightly. "What does?" "This," she whispered, gesturing faintly between them. "This silence." He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "Strange can be beautiful." She froze, his words sinking deep. For a long moment they simply sat there, breathing the same air, listening to the same clock, caught in the same silence that spoke louder than anything else. And though nothing had happened, No touch. No confession. The room was already different. The morning was no longer just warmth and comfort. It was filled with stillness, charged with something new, something that felt too tender to name. Crossing lines, the silence lingered, heavy but alive. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart beating faster than she wanted it to. He remained across from her, steady, calm on the outside, though something flickered in his eyes. The house seemed to shrink around them, the walls closer, the air warmer. She tried to laugh, to lighten the moment, but her voice came out soft and shaky. "You're staring again." His lips curved into a slow smile. "So are you." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked down at the table, tracing the wood grain with her fingertip. Maybe we should stop before it feels too strange." "Strange doesn't always mean wrong," he said gently, his voice low. The words sat between them like a quiet secret, too heavy to ignore, too dangerous to fully hold. She looked up, her eyes catching his, and for a moment neither of them breathed. The clock ticked on the wall, but even its rhythm felt slower now, stretched thin by the weight of the silence. Somewhere outside, the wind brushed against the curtains, making the light sway across their faces. She finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "If anyone saw us sitting like this—" "No one will," he interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "It's just us here." Her breath hitched again, and she pressed her lips together, unsure what to say. She wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into the safety of his voice, but her thoughts tangled with questions she couldn't speak aloud. He leaned forward slightly, his arms resting on the table. His eyes stayed locked on hers, steady and unwavering. "You feel it too, don't you?" Her heart pounded, and she wanted to deny it, to laugh it away, but her lips refused to move. The silence itself became her answer. He sighed softly, almost like a whisper. "I shouldn't say these things." "But you did," she whispered back. The air thickened again. She shifted in her seat, her fingers curling into the tablecloth. She could feel the warmth of his gaze, could almost feel it like a touch, though he hadn't moved closer. He chuckled lightly, though there was no humor in it. "Maybe I've already crossed a line just by saying what's in my heart." Her chest tightened at his words, and her voice came out shaky, almost pleading. "Then what happens now?" He looked at her for a long moment, the silence stretching. Finally, he smiled faintly, though it was bittersweet. "You know what happened next." Her breath caught and her eyes widened. The words weren't a confession, but they were more than enough. They carried a meaning that didn't need to be explained. Her imagination filled the space between them, filling in the unsaid with a flood of warmth, fear, and longing. She tried to laugh again, to ease the weight. "You always talk in riddles." "Some truths are better spoken that way," he said softly. The room felt different now, heavier, and yet strangely light. She shifted closer, her elbow brushing the edge of the table. Her hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, closer to his. Not touching, but close, so close that the space between their skin felt like a fragile thread ready to snap. He noticed. His eyes flicked down, then back to hers. His hand stayed still, steady, as if waiting, as if holding back a storm. The air was filled with small sounds, the faint hum of the fridge, the rustle of the curtains, the steady tick of the clock. But beneath it all was another rhythm, hidden but strong. The sound of her heartbeat, the sound of his breath. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't stop there, did we?" He didn't answer with words. His silence was enough, his eyes saying what his lips couldn't. It was the kind of silence that carried everything. Fear, longing, tenderness, and something forbidden. Her hand trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she let it rest there, close to his, as if daring the moment to decide for them. The sunlight caught the edges of her hair, framing her face in soft gold, and he looked at her as if she were something both fragile and unshakable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a sigh. "We crossed a line the moment we let the silence speak for us." Her chest rose and fell, each breath deeper than the last. She wanted to argue, to deny, but deep down she knew he was right. The line had already blurred, and neither of them could go back. The clock chimed softly, marking another minute gone. Yet time felt strange now, stretched thin and heavy, as if the world outside had faded completely. Only the two of them remained, caught in the stillness of their own secret. She leaned back slowly, breaking the eye contact, but the weight of his gaze stayed on her. Her lips curved into a small, trembling smile. "Then I guess we can't pretend anymore." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, steady and calm. "No, we can't." The silence returned, but it was no longer the same. It was deeper now, fuller, charged with everything they had not said but both understood. And though the room looked unchanged, the same table, the same clock, the same golden light, they both knew something had shifted forever. Emotional refuge. The morning had grown quieter, almost too quiet. The clock still ticked steady and faithful, but its sound seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another room. The air was heavy yet soft, like a blanket pulled too tightly. She sat still, her eyes lowered, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Across the table, he didn't move either. He watched her, steady, patient, as though waiting for something she wasn't sure she could give. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was faint, almost a whisper. "Do you ever feel lonely?" He blinked at the question, surprised. His eyes softened and he leaned back in his chair. "All the time," he said gently. "But I don't tell anyone that." She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes. "Why not?" "Because no one asks," he replied. His voice carried a weight, like each word was a truth he had held inside for too long. And maybe because they wouldn't understand. Her heart ached at his words. She swallowed hard, her lips parting but no sound coming at first. Then she whispered, "I'd understand." The room grew warmer again, filled with a silence that felt fragile, like glass. He looked at her carefully, as though testing whether she truly meant it. And in her eyes he saw no doubt. He sighed, a sound heavy with years of silence. "There are nights I sit alone listening to the house creak, and it feels like the walls are pressing in. I think about all the things I wanted to do, all the things I didn't say, and I wonder if it even matters now." Her chest tightened and she leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "It matters," she said quickly, almost desperately. "It always matters." He studied her, his expression soft but unreadable. "And you? What do you think about at night?" She hesitated, her breath catching. For a moment she wanted to lie, to say something simple and safe, but the weight of his honesty pulled something out of her, something she had never said aloud. "I think about being invisible," she whispered, "like I'm in a room full of people and no one really sees me. They look, they smile, but they don't see who I am inside. And sometimes—" Her voice faltered and she looked down at the table. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be seen at all." The words hung in the air, fragile and trembling. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting, and for a moment, she hated herself for saying too much. But when she looked up again, his gaze was steady, full of something so deep it almost broke her. "You're seen," he said firmly, his voice low but certain. "Right now. You're not invisible." Her lips parted, but no words came. His gaze held her in place, strong and unshakable. And for the first time in a long time, she believed someone. The silence between them softened, turning from heavy to tender. She felt her heart slow, though it beat deeply in her chest. The air was thick, but it carried something gentle now, something safe. He reached for his cup, but his hand paused halfway. Slowly, carefully, he set it back down without drinking. His eyes stayed on hers. "You have no idea how much it means to sit here and be heard." Her voice trembled as she answered. "You have no idea how much it means to sit here and be seen." Their words overlapped, folding into each other like two parts of the same confession. They both stopped, surprised, then smiled faintly, though their eyes carried something much deeper. A breeze slipped through the open window, brushing the curtains. The sound of leaves rustling outside filled the silence, soft and distant. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the air cool her warm cheeks, then opened them again to find him still watching her. "I feel safe with you," she whispered, her words spilling out before she could stop them. His expression changed, something raw flickering across his face. He looked down, his hand brushing the table slowly, almost absently. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "And I feel alive with you." Her breath caught, and the silence after his words felt like the deepest one yet. She could feel the truth in them, could feel the weight of what he had just given her. It was not just a sentence. It was a piece of his heart. Neither of them moved for a long time. The clock ticked, the birds sang faintly in the distance, and the world kept spinning. But in that moment, it felt like only the two of them existed. Two souls sitting in a quiet room, confessing truths they had never spoken before. She wanted to reach out, to close the space between them, but her hand stayed in her lap. Her courage only reached her lips and they curved into a trembling smile. Then maybe, we shouldn't run from this. He looked at her, his eyes wide, almost startled. But then he sighed softly, his face softening again. Maybe not, he whispered. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was warm, gentle, protective. It wrapped around them like a refuge, giving them a space where they could exist, seen, heard, and understood. And though the morning was moving on, the light shifting slowly across the room, they remained in that stillness, holding on to the fragile, beautiful truth that had finally been spoken. Bittersweet realization. The room felt softer now, as if their confessions had changed its shape. The air was warmer, fuller, carrying the weight of words too fragile to forget. She sat still, her eyes lowered, but her lips held the faintest smile. He watched her quietly, his cup untouched, his hands resting on the table as though he didn't trust them to move. For a while, they said nothing. The silence was not sharp anymore. It was tender, like the hush of a church or the quiet that follows after rain. And yet, behind that peace, another feeling began to stir. Something heavier, something that pressed against both their hearts. She felt it first. The comfort of being seen, of being safe, began to twist into something she couldn't hold without trembling. Her chest ached, not from fear, but from knowing that the moment was fragile, that it couldn't stretch on forever. She lifted her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was unsteady. "Grandpa," she paused, her throat tightening. "What happens when this ends?" His gaze broke from hers, falling toward the table. He let out a long breath, the kind that carried years of silence and unspoken things. "That is the part I don't want to think about," he said quietly. "But we have to," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes still lowered. The truth of her words pressed into him like the weight of a stone. He wanted to deny it, to say that what they shared could stay in this room, untouched by the world outside. But he knew better. The world had a way of finding out, of judging, of tearing fragile things apart. The clock ticked again, each sound sharper now. Time had returned, reminding them that it had never stopped. She leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. "I don't want to lose this," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't want to go back to feeling invisible." His heart ached at her words. He reached forward, his hand stopping just short of hers, close but not touching. "And I don't want to go back to silence," he admitted, his voice rough. "You make me feel alive again." Their eyes met, and in that look everything was laid bare, the longing, the fear, the tenderness, the danger. Neither of them moved, but the space between their hands burned like fire. She blinked, tears shining faintly in her eyes. "Then why does it hurt?" "Because we know it can't last," he whispered. The words cut through the air, sharp but true. Her chest tightened and she turned her face away, staring at the window where the sunlight spilled in. The golden light no longer felt warm, it felt heavy, like a spotlight that could reveal their secret at any moment. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. If only the world would stay outside. If only it was just us. His eyes softened, his voice low. "In here it is just us. But the world, it always finds a way back in." The truth of his words wrapped around them like a shadow. The silence that followed was different now. Not tender, not safe. It was bittersweet, like the last note of a song you don't want to end. Her hands clenched in her lap, her nails pressing into her skin. She wanted to scream, to cry, to fight against the truth, but instead she whispered, "We didn't stop there, did we?" His breath caught. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. His gaze was steady but filled with sorrow. "No," he said softly. "We didn't." Her heart pounded at his words. She felt the memory of the silence they had already crossed, the line they had already blurred. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a secret too heavy for the morning light. For a long moment, neither spoke. They only listened to the world around them, the soft rustle of the curtains, the faint song of a bird returning outside, the steady tick of the clock. Life moved on, but inside the room, time seemed to hold them still. Finally, he pushed back his chair slowly, the wood creaking under the shift. He stood, his movements careful, almost reluctant. His footsteps sounded heavy on the floor, as though each one carried the weight of goodbye. She looked up quickly, her voice trembling. "Are you leaving?" He paused, his hand resting on the back of the chair. No, he said softly. I need a moment. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. She understood. The feelings between them were too big for the small room, too sharp to hold without breaking. He turned slightly toward the window, his profile outlined by the golden light. His voice came again, low and rough. Sometimes the most beautiful things are also the most dangerous. She blinked hard, her tears finally slipping free. Then why does it feel so right? His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. He didn't answer, not directly. Instead, he whispered, "Because it is." The words left her trembling, her heart torn between joy and sorrow. She wanted to run to him, to close the space between them, but her body stayed still. The silence held her in place, the truth too sharp to escape. The morning light shifted again, casting long shadows across the floor. The room felt both full and empty, alive and broken, and in that fragile space both of them understood. What they shared was real, but it was also fleeting. It would stay with them, yes, but not in the way they wanted. The realization settled deep in their hearts, bittersweet, beautiful, impossible to ignore. Fading echo, the house had grown quieter again, though the quiet felt different now. It was not the warm silence of morning, nor the charged silence that had filled the air between them. This silence was heavy, tired, like the last note of a song stretched too long. She sat at the table, her hands resting on the cool wood, her eyes lowered to the patterns in the grain. The light from the window had shifted softer now as the day moved on. The golden glow no longer felt like comfort. It felt like a reminder that time was passing, that the moment they had shared was slipping further into memory with every tick of the clock. Grandpa still stood near the window, his back half turned, the light outlining him in pale fire. He didn't speak, not at first. His hand rested on the sill, his fingers tapping faintly, a rhythm that almost matched the beating of her heart. She wanted him to say something, anything, but his silence carried more weight than words. Finally, he turned. His eyes met hers across the room, and in that look was everything they had shared. Warmth, laughter, confession, longing, and the unspoken truth that it could not last. He smiled faintly, though it was a fragile smile, the kind that carries both love and sorrow. "You should eat something," he said softly, his voice steady but low. She let out a small laugh, though it trembled. "That's the first thing you think of?" His smile deepened just slightly, though his eyes did not lighten. "It's easier than saying goodbye." Her throat tightened and her fingers curled against the table. The word goodbye felt too sharp, too final. She shook her head. "Don't say it." "Not yet." He crossed the room slowly, his footsteps soft but steady. Each sound echoed faintly in the quiet, carrying the weight of his presence. When he reached the table, he set his hand on the back of the chair he had been sitting in earlier, but he didn't sit down. He only looked at her, his eyes soft, his lips pressed into a line as if holding back words. She forced a smile, though it quivered. "When they come back, everything will go back to normal." His gaze lowered and he nodded slowly. "Yes, but it won't feel normal," she added quickly, her voice breaking. His eyes lifted again, and for the first time she saw tears glistening faintly there. He blinked, but they did not fall. "No," he whispered. "It won't." The truth hung between them, sharp but undeniable. They could not undo what had been spoken, what had been felt. It would remain hidden in the walls of the house, in the silence of the mornings, in the faint memory of golden light on the table. She wanted to reach for him, to close the space between them, but her hand stayed still. Something inside her knew that touching him now would make the farewell impossible. Instead, she whispered, "Promise me one thing." He leaned forward slightly, listening. "What is it?" "Don't forget this," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't forget me." His chest rose with a deep breath, and he closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. "I couldn't, even if I tried." The words broke her, and she lowered her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. The silence that followed was thick but tender, like an embrace neither of them could give. The clock ticked again. The sound of a car passing faintly outside reminded them that the world was still moving, that soon the quiet house would no longer belong only to them. He straightened slowly, his hand brushing the back of the chair one last time. His footsteps moved toward the hallway, soft but steady. She listened to every sound, each step, each faint creak of the floorboards, holding on to them as though they were pieces of him she could keep. At the doorway, he paused. He didn't turn, but his voice carried back to her low and heavy. Some things can't be named, but they stay with us forever. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Her voice had left her, stolen by the weight of his words. She only sat there, listening, her hands trembling against the table. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. A door opened softly, then clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the house. The silence that followed was deeper than any before. She sat alone now, the sunlight dimming as the curtain swayed gently in the breeze. The cup of coffee he had left on the table was still half full, the steam long gone. She reached out and touched it lightly, her fingers brushing the cool porcelain. It felt like a shadow of him, a fading echo of his presence. Her tears slipped freely now, though she made no sound. The house was quiet, the walls heavy with secrets, the clock ticking on as if nothing had changed. But inside her everything had. She leaned back slowly, her eyes closing, her breath shaky. The moment was gone, but it lived inside her still, in the silence, in the warmth, in the bittersweet ache of being both seen and left behind. Outside, the world carried on. Inside, only the fading echo remained.